product in America, and we will give you among the lowest taxes of any nation on earth.
We will not shy away from taking action against illegal actions by the President of the United States or anyone else.
Pete Hegseth has shown himself not only incapable of running a large organization, he often shows himself incapable of showing up.
I think he's the right guy, and I am looking forward to working with him.
Hello, I'm Robert Costa in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Tonight, a roadblock for President Trump as he signs more executive orders covering AI, crypto, and pardons for anti-abortion rights protesters. Plus, there have been declassifications for JFK, RFK, and MLK assassination documents. It comes as a federal judge in Seattle temporarily has stalled his plans to end birthright citizenship. Why that judge is calling the order blatantly unconstitutional. Plus tariffs, tax cuts all on the horizon. President Trump addresses those for the group gathered at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, his virtual message on his plans to build the U.S. economy.
If you don't make your product in America, which is your prerogative, then very simply you will have to pay a tariff to further unleash our economy. Our majorities in the House and Senate, which we also took along with the presidency, are going to pass the largest tax cut in American history, including massive tax cuts for workers and family.
And on Capitol Hill, the Senate has now confirmed John Ratcliffe to lead the Central Intelligence Agency. Well, President Trump's pick to lead the Defense Department, he might be on shaky ground. It's an uncertain scene in the Senate as Senators Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, two centrist Republicans, become the first in the GOP to say they won't vote to confirm Pete Hegseth. We start our discussion tonight with Olivia Rinaldi and Scott McFarland, two of the best. Great to have you both here. Scott, you're on Capitol Hill. What is the latest on Pete Hegseth's nomination?
The statements late today from Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski that they were not going to support this nomination had a lot of symmetry, Bob. Both of them reference Hegseth's previous comments criticizing women in combat roles. Both acknowledge Hegseth seems to have evolved his thinking, but that they weren't confident he's evolved enough. Lisa Murkowski added that she was troubled or given pause by the allegations of alcohol misuse and sexual misconduct by Hegseth, accusations he has denied. None of this changes the trajectory Pete Hegseth is on. It appears destined he will win the necessary votes tomorrow night because two defecting Republicans is not sufficient to end this nomination. And it does appear, Bob, this vote is to happen late tomorrow night.
Let's see what President Trump had to say to our colleague Weijia Jiang earlier today. Let's listen.
Are you worried about his confirmation and your reaction?
And no surprises there. It's too bad. You know, it's the way it is. Too bad.
So you have President Trump standing by Pete Hegseth. Olivia, when you talk to sources close to President Trump, are they feeling good about Hegseth's chances?
You know, they're still watching very closely what's happening in the Senate. Obviously, we heard from two centrist Republicans, Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. Those aren't quite surprising. People knew that they might be on the fence, but they need a simple majority to get this by, to get this nomination passed. So they're watching very closely. I've been talking with people close to Vance's circle. Obviously, if he needs to step in to be that tie-breaking vote, he will. They are confident that this will get across, though.
Interesting. President Trump, Scott, continues to move forward with his executive actions. Let's listen to what Trump said about the judge's ruling earlier today.
Obviously, we'll appeal it. They put it before a certain judge in Seattle, I guess, right? And there's no surprises with that judge.
So, Scott, there's also all of the legislative outlook on the immigration border front. What's going on with that, even as the president pursues his executive orders?
Yeah, this executive order, which was to revoke birthright citizenship, a fundamental, foundational part codified in the U.S. Constitution for U.S. citizenship. The federal judge in Seattle, who was a Reagan appointee, he's been around a while, said this was absolutely unconstitutional on its face. The judge said it declaratively in the opening moments of the proceedings today over the Trump executive order. Trump's allies in the U.S. House have, over the course of this day, introduced legislation to make it law that birthright citizenship no longer exists in the United States. And that's a process, and a Herculean process, to try to get that through the Congress. But this feels like one of those things, Bob, where Trump wins either way. It looks like he's trying to get something done that he campaigned on, and if somebody stands in the way, it looks like somebody's standing in the way of what he wants to do and what his voters want to have happen.
So there's a lot happening on Capitol Hill. You have legislation, you have everyone processing the executive orders, you have these nominations. Olivia, you've been tracking President Trump and his executive orders. It's been such a blizzard of activity. It's hard for anyone, even reporters who do this for a living, to follow the activity. Where do you find significance and meaning in some of these executive orders as someone who has covered not only the campaign but the transition? What are you watching? What have you learned?
Yeah, Bob. 3 big executive orders signed today that follow through on campaign promises that he talked about throughout the 2 years that he ran. One being releasing the JFK, RFK, and MLK files. He talked about that frequently. He signed an executive order today saying that he would release those soon. Now, there has to be certain people in place, including the CIA director, for review to happen of those files before they are ultimately released, but the ball is rolling on that. Another one I want to bring up is Bitcoin. I've been following this very closely. I'm fascinated by it. The Bitcoin crypto community loves Trump. They've been embracing him. They certainly threw a lot of weight behind him throughout the entire campaign. But what we're starting to find, too, and you're seeing a bolstering of Bitcoin since he was reelected. Now it's over $100,000 per Bitcoin. Very interesting. But they believe that Trump is going to create what they're calling a essentially stockpile reserve of Bitcoin, which would certainly bolster the cryptocurrency. So Trump today signed an executive order that would create a Bitcoin internal group. We saw David Sachs there in the Oval Office. He's Trump's crypto czar, essentially. And this would make the U.S. essentially the crypto capital of the world. People within the crypto space that I talk to are extremely excited about this announcement. I cannot even begin to tell you, because what that means is that the U.S. will become the premier group in really essentially giving way to Bitcoin being a currency that we can use for bank transactions, but also for your 401ks, your investments. It's legitimizing this cryptocurrency. So Trump really opening the door to that. Quite notable.
It really is. And Scott, meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, you're tracking the fallout over President Trump's pardons of those involved in January 6th. What are you learning?
Yeah, there's an emerging concern, Bob, that these pardons now have created a threat, a safety threat for some of the Democrats on the Hill, the police officers who testified at the trials, the tipsters who flagged the FBI agents about these riot defendants, that there may be some seeking of revenge. Also, still a lot of political outrage that a blanket pardon was issued in the first place. Take a listen to Senator Andy Kim, who you'll recall, Bob, was on his hands and knees cleaning up the damage of the riot on January 6th.
The pardons were blanket, and it was everybody. You concerned about what that means for political violence moving forward?
Well, it gives the stamp of approval now about political violence, saying that, you know, if you conduct political violence and it's in favor of Donald Trump for the next 4 years, that you'll be okay.
Bob, you recall Oath Keepers founder and January 6th defendant Elmer Stewart Rhodes was at the Capitol yesterday. A lot of the police noticed him in one of the Capitol office buildings.
Thank you, Scott. And finally, Olivia, you have President Trump talking to world leaders. Let's listen to what he had to say today about Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia will be investing at least $600 billion in America, but I'll be asking the Crown Prince, who's a fantastic guy, to round it out to around $1 trillion. I think they'll do that.
What have you learned about whether President Trump's going to go there in the coming weeks or not?
Yeah, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, saying he's going to invest about $600 billion in the U.S. over the next 4 years, a direct result of Trump being elected. Trump today, though, in Davos said he'd like to see that go up to $1 trillion. A little bit of negotiation going on from him there. But we know during his first administration back in 2017, his first international trip was to Saudi Arabia. Now, that was a big signal to everyone in the Middle East. That's an ally of the U.S., and he's going to really cultivate that relationship. Now, during the Biden years, it got a little frosty. You know, Biden gave a little bit of space there, especially after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, something that created a rift between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, certainly under the Biden presidency. But Trump today saying he spoke with the Crown Prince, called him a fantastic guy. And earlier this week, we heard from President Trump in the Oval Office saying that he could potentially replicate what he did back in 2017 and make his first international trip Saudi Arabia again. Now, that would certainly signal to all of our allies in the Middle East that this is an important relationship. Again, he is focused on cultivating it. Also sends a big message to the ongoing war between Israel and Gaza about what he's thinking there, and perhaps that normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, something he was working on within those final days in office.
Great. Thank you, Olivia Rinaldi. Scott McFarland, we appreciate your reporting. As always, President Trump gives his first Oval Office interview since returning to the White House, what he had to say about his plans for the next 4 years and about former President Joe Biden. You're watching America Decides.
I'm not looking to go back into the past. I'm looking to make our country successful. Retribution will be through success.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was President Donald Trump last month. On Monday, former President Biden issued preemptive pardons for his family, which the now current president weighed in about last night with Sean Hannity on Fox News.
This guy went around giving everybody pardons. And you know, the funny thing, maybe the sad thing, is he didn't give himself a pardon.
Jennifer Jacobs and Finn Gomez join us now, two of the best here at CBS. Jennifer is a senior White House reporter for CBS News. Finn serves as CBS News' political director. Great to have both of you here. Jen, let's begin with you. What's your latest reporting about President Trump? He was speaking virtually to Davos earlier today, taking on some of the bankers, taking on some of the foreign leaders. What's the core message, and what are you hearing behind the scenes?
Yeah, so elites have been something that's been on Trump's mind a lot lately. So I've got two things that I can talk to you about, and that is the elites that went to a very special fundraiser over at the inauguration weekend, and I can also talk to you about bankers. So I can start with the bankers. My sources have been telling me since early January that he'd had banks on his mind, not for any particular policy reason, but because it seemed like they were not courting him as a customer. I'd been told that he had rejected a meeting with JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon, and he had been searching for a new bank. He did eventually find one, but it did come out today when he was speaking to the elites at Davos. He kind of unleashed on one of the bankers who was on stage at Davos, Brian Moynihan from Bank of America. He said, hey, I hope you guys change. It seems like the banks have not been working with conservatives, not been doing business with conservatives, and kind of just let loose on the guy as he's in front of all these people at this global forum. So that was one thing. And then I know there were some bankers in the crowd at this inaugural event. It was called the Candlelight Dinner. So it's a tale of seat hijacking, which might seem like kind of a frivolous thing, but this is all about power and people trying to get close to President Trump and who's courting him, who's going to be in his good graces and who's not. So this was one of the coldest nights that we've had so far, one of the coldest inaugural eves in 40 years. You've got some of the wealthiest mega GOP donors freezing for up to 90 minutes, standing in line to try to get into this event. They get inside and they find that some of their name placards have been moved. And it had a cascading effect. There were the seats moved at the tables closest to where the president and first lady were going to sit, and then other people had gone in and had tampered with the other seating arrangements. So you had some very wealthy people whose name cards were switched. One person was sitting next to a cabinet secretary. His seat was moved across the table. So there were little seat thieves that were, at work here as everyone was kind of jostling to get up to the front. And then you had someone from another bank who had a very prominent seat, and people started talking about that, saying, hey, that's a banker who supported someone else besides Trump in the 2024 election. So it became quite the topic of conversation at this dinner about who was seated where, who was closest to who was in the room, who was stealing seats. It was quite a bit of drama, Bob.
Finn, what are you hearing about the Trump first week in office, the first week back?
I think they're absolutely just full of confidence and just they feel that they've achieved everything they've wanted to achieve in their first less than a week back in power. Not only with the historic amount of executive actions that he took on the first day throughout the week, but just frankly and just like the impact that he's having not only domestically but globally. Bob, I remember being with President Trump at his first visit to Davos back in 2018, I believe, and I remember going with him. And there at that time was almost Gatsby, like from The Great Gatsby, where there was this guy who just wanted to be accepted, this boy from Queens. He just wanted to be accepted by these global economic leaders. And now he's going there and he's really sort of setting the tone. It's a very different Trump that we saw just a few years ago. And I think it's just very, and I think it's demonstrated not only by his speech, but what he's accomplished. They feel that he's accomplished this past week.
Jen, you've done a lot of reporting on the West Wing, how it's being set up, not just in terms of personnel, but in terms of office space. What are the new power dynamics inside of the Trump West Wing in terms of who's around the chief of staff, who has access to the Oval Office, and who might only have access to the Eisenhower Executive Office building?
Ooh.
That's something we're always studying, isn't it? And so today, for example, Sergio Gore was at the White House, and a media personality, Charlie Kirk, was at his elbow. Sergio, of course, has been working on personnel and populating those offices in the West Wing. So Sergio came out to the North Lawn and did Fox News and said that they now have 1,300 political appointees out of the 4,000 that they're trying to reach. So Sergio is in the inner circle. In the Oval Office today, you had David Sachs, who is Trump's AI and cryptocurrencies czar. He was there as Trump was signing some executive orders. You had Margot Martin, who was a press aide in the last Trump administration, and now she is closer to Trump and has a seat right outside Trump's office, right in the outer oval is what they call it. A few people who have been with Trump and have been very loyal to him all along, including Walt Nauta. So it's always interesting. We're studying who's in the Oval, who Trump chooses to have with him when he invites the press in, and they're still sorting out whose offices are going to be where.
Jen, just to pause there for a moment. You mentioned this name, Sergio Gore. Not everyone knows who Sergio Gore is. Who is Sergio Gore? He runs Office of Personnel.
Right.
Why is he powerful, and why does he have Trump's ear?
Yeah, he's popular in Trump world. He's a friend of Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr. He has been very professionally reaching out to various people who want jobs in the administration or working to recruit people. So if you're a VIP who is seeking a top position, you might get a phone call from Sergio Gore saying, tell me about your qualifications. How would you, handle this policy, or what's your vision for this, or what's your strategy on that? And he would kind of interview people on the phone. So he's been the person who's been working to just recruit people who he thinks would pass a loyalty test of some sort that would be very kind of obedient to Trump's vision and really stand by what the president wants and not go off on their own agenda.
Like the gatekeeper almost in a lot of ways.
Exactly.
These positions, yeah.
Is Susie Wiles still a gatekeeper?
Oh, definitely. She's the most powerful
The
gatekeeper.
most powerful. Yeah, she is the gate. I mean, honestly, frankly, in that office, and what we've seen, what we talked about, what we all reported, is the fact that Susie Wiles comes into the office probably being the most powerful chief of staff in recent years, in recent administrations, and especially in Trump world. If you remember, Bob, who was Donald Trump's first chief of staff? Reince Priebus, the former RNC chair, who was considered very weak at the time. This is a completely different chief of staff.
Finn, do you believe Carolyn Leavitt, the new press secretary, is going to hold press briefings, or is there a new culture around how communications and press work inside of the Oval Office?
I think she is. She's told us that she will. I think she's also said that she does not want to step on the president if he's having public remarks. Right, Jen? I think we both reported on the same thing.
Yes.
And that's what. So
she'll have them, but just not with the same regularity as we saw maybe with Karine Jean-Pierre.
Right, and I think we might see some guests in the briefing room, whether it's President Trump himself or others coming in to brief the press on different matters.
Oh, I could see that. I could definitely see that, especially a lot more than we saw with Joe Biden. That's definitely something we're going to see. But also, if you recall, during the first Trump 1.0, Stephanie Grisham didn't hold the press conference for like a year, like 9 months. So you've seen those different types of examples set. But with this one, I think it'll probably be more on the lines of like Sarah Huckabee Sanders or maybe even Kayleigh McEnany towards the end of that first Trump tenure. I do think you're going to see her speak a lot. And I think it's going to be very, very, very more aligned with the president than what perhaps we've seen with previous spokespeople.
Finn Gomez, Jennifer Jacobs, thanks for stopping by.
Thanks, Bob.
We appreciate it. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church weighing in on President Trump's immigration executive orders. Coming up next, criticism from some clergy. You're watching America Decides. A growing number of church leaders are criticizing President Trump's immigration policies. A prominent Catholic church leader said, quote, some provisions contained in the executive orders, such as those focused on the treatment of immigrants and refugees, are deeply troubling and will have negative consequences in their view. Let's bring in now Bishop Mark Seitz. He's the chairman of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Migration. Bishop, thanks for being here. We appreciate you taking the time.
Pleasure to be with you.
Is the Catholic Church in the United States taking a formal position on President Trump's immigration policies in recent days?
We are. We think we have to speak to many of these policies, which we see as going against some of the basic tenets of our faith, frankly. The fundamental right of every human person that need to be respected, no matter their origin, no matter their situation.
What is the strategy for the church in the United States, if any, in terms of dealing with this administration beyond the immigration issues this week? Do you have a big picture four-year approach to how you're going to handle this moment?
Well, I think all of us are, in the church and without, are looking to see what shape this administration takes and what positions they actually land on. I don't think any of us knows exactly, but things have come into a clearer light in regard to the immigration questions right now, and so we're responding to those.
Is the Vatican paying close attention to what's happening here in the U.S. and Pope Francis? Are they keeping tabs on this through the conference? And do you expect Catholic leaders, including the Pope, to meet with President Trump at some point this year?
Well, I can't say what Pope Francis's plans might be, but he certainly is paying attention, and he has spoken to some of the concerns based on what the president, now president, said during his campaign. He expressed a great deal of concern about some of the proposals.
You've talked about in your statement in recent days that the president needs to be more merciful, to pick out a word I saw in that statement. What do you mean by that when it comes to politics and policy? How does that translate into what you would like to see happen?
From a Christian point of view, there's no way to really speak about justice without mercy. Mercy is part of it. You can't simply take a law and then present it as though it is its literal wording explains the whole or deals with the whole reality. So mercy has to temper the way that justice is practiced, and very often with a sweeping kind of statements that are coming from the administration, we don't see that happening.
Bishop, you are in El Paso, Texas, near the U.S.-Mexican border. What's your own personal experience with migrants and dealing with migrant issues?
Well, our church has actually received many immigrants after they were processed by the Border Patrol and in their journey on to other locations. So we've had the chance to interact with thousands of people who had passed through. I can say, for instance, in the shelter that was run by our diocese, that in years of receiving people, we had not one violent incident in that shelter in all of those years. In fact, we saw a great deal of faith. We saw a great deal of goodness. They were all ready to help us in the shelter and do whatever they could with a great deal of gratitude for the assistance we gave.
And just finally, Bishop, when you think about the Catholic Church in the United States, some parishioners at your church and in your area and others across the country might agree with your position on immigration. They might disagree. What do you say to those who disagree with the church's official position, and how should they handle it, in your view, as a church official?
Well, the way that our church is set up, we do have a hierarchy, and there are those who are appointed to be faithful to the teachings of Christ. Of course, the Pope is the main representative of that, and he sums up the authority of the church. There are also bishops who, along with him, come together and affirm that teaching. And we believe that those who are in that position are given the assistance of the Holy Spirit. So I'm not saying that everything a bishop says or even a pope says is absolutely defined by that, but one who hears what the leaders of the church are saying as a Catholic Christian certainly needs to take it very seriously. Step back, don't just react. Listen, read the Gospels, because that's where we get most of our stuff.
And just real quick, one final question. Cardinal Dolan, many Americans saw, the Archbishop of New York, gave an invocation, spoke at President Trump's inaugural. Where does he stand versus where the U.S. conference stands on this issue?
Oh, if you go back to the last several months and look at his statements, you'll find no stronger spokesperson for the dignity and rights of immigrants than Cardinal Dolan.
Bishop Mark Seitz in El Paso, Texas, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
President Trump promising a shock and awe campaign this week to deliver on what he promised during the campaign. And on Capitol Hill, Democrats are at times, in their view, struggling to find a message against President Trump as they figure out being the opposition. Our political panel will weigh in next on the Democrats and other issues. Welcome back. A bill expanding the federal government's mandate to detain immigrants who are in the U.S. illegally is expected to be the first measure President Trump signs into law in the coming weeks. The House passed the Republican-led bill with support from 46 Democrats. The measure was also approved in the Senate with bipartisan support on Monday. Let's bring in our panel. Daniela Diaz is a congressional reporter for Politico. Jasmine Wright, a reporter for Notice. Great to have both of you here, two of the best. So, Jasmine, we'll begin with you. You're at the White House now covering President Trump. How is President Trump and his allies, how are they handling this week based on your reporting?
Yeah, well, I think that they believe that they're having an extremely efficient week. A lot of the promises that he made over those 2 years on the campaign trail, they say that they're fulfilling, a lot of them through executive order, but they're fulfilling them and they're doing it quite quickly. I was talking to one person who was a former Trump official, and they said that just looking at the cadence of things that have happened in the first 4 days at Trump's White House compared to 2017 is night and day. And so therefore, this White House is more organized, it's more structured than what he had previously. Now, I think that there are a couple of things that are working against them. Particularly, there are not a lot of people right now working at the White House. They've only filled out about a third of the people that they wanted to fill out in terms of the 4,000 political appointees that are around the government. And so some things are happening a little bit slower. They're kind of getting used to where they are, where the light switches are, and all those types of things. But they feel that the cadence that Trump is on right now, already speaking to foreign leaders, already putting out executive order after executive order, already fulfilling the promises that he made on immigration, repealing certain EOs on energy and other things like that, that it is going exactly how they planned, not just in the last 3 months in transition, but also in the last 2 years, all those kind of Trump-aligned think tanks and what they've been planning while he was out of office.
So there's certainly a rapid pace coming from President Trump and his allies inside the White House. Daniela, we just spoke to a Catholic bishop who's opposing the immigration policies being outlined by President Trump, but there's also opposition on Capitol Hill. You've been covering Democrats. What are you learning about how Democrats are handling President Trump this week, especially on immigration?
Well, I think the bigger picture here is that a lot of Democrats are voting with President Trump and immigration, and that's the problem, right? We're seeing progressives in the Democratic caucus, in the House, and in the Senate really divided on how they need to respond in a Trump administration when it comes to this issue of immigration, when that's what the Republicans went on in November. So there was actually some infighting in the Democratic House with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus members, who of course lead on this issue, are always the ones that talk about this. They had a meeting where House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries actually stopped by to listen, where they were saying, we need to have a better cohesive message on tackling this issue, considering we're watching more battleground district Democrats vote with Republicans, for example, on the Lake and Riley Act. I mean, it got a lot of support in the Senate from red state Democrats, talking Arizona, Nevada. So it's an issue that they have to grapple with, that they haven't figured out yet, that we're seeing happening in real time for how they're going to handle this, considering they have midterms coming up in 2 years. Also crazy talking about midterms, but it is something that always happens right after an election.
And you mentioned Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader in the House. Jasmine, you've spent a lot of time covering the Democrats in recent years.
Yeah.
Based on your reporting, your conversation with your sources, Vice President Harris, President Biden, Hakeem Jeffries, who's leading the Democratic Party right now, if anyone?
I mean, I think that's the question on most Democrats' mouths. Who is going to really step up to the call? I don't think Democrats want to hear from Joe Biden. Obviously, he was last in Washington on Monday. He says that he is going to stick around. I think people are very openly questioning how much that's going to be, not just due to his age, but seriously due to his position in the party. The vice president went back to California. Obviously, she is considering her next steps. Who knows really what those will look like? And so I think that the Democratic Party is kind of leaderless, and they know that. They're hoping that these elections for the Democratic National Committee chair kind of fill in some of that vacuum as they look for a larger leader to come on and really make some decisions about where the party should go and how the party should operate in this new Trump age. But certainly I think that there's a lot of confusion about what happened in November and how they kind of lost so decisively, even though they managed to stave off some of the larger losses on the House side. There's some confusion about that and the way to go forward, but also about who can be this kind of new generation leader to patch together a Democratic Party that in a lot of ways feels really fragmented.
Let's pull up on the screen Senator Murkowski and Senator Susan Collins. We began the program tonight by talking about the Hegseth nomination on Capitol Hill. He has not yet been confirmed. Two Republican senators are publicly opposed now to Mr. Hegseth and his nomination for Secretary of Defense. Danielle, in the last few minutes, what's the mood, the talk on Capitol Hill? Are there any new developments?
There are developments. Actually, just while you have been on air, a story broke that actually Hegseth paid a woman who accused him of sexual assault in 2017 $50,000. That's a report that has not been out yet. That was in a report that Senator Elizabeth Warren got in her questioning of Hegseth. And even though the Senate just voted to advance Hegseth to be defense secretary, and we saw Murkowski and Collins vote against it, this report could be damaging for him ahead of the vote, the final vote to confirm him tomorrow. So while this is still developing, it's going to be really interesting to see those senators who may have been on the fence about Hegseth and then decided to support him, namely Joni Ernst is someone I'm thinking about. Yeah. And this has always been an issue for her when talking about sexual assault in the military. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this develops. I'm sure that we're going to get more statements from senators, definitely Democratic senators, in the time to come. But it's just a day, less than a day until that vote, and it's going to be pretty dramatic considering this report just broke.
And Daniela, briefly, for those who don't follow this every minute, what's the math? Yeah. So you have Senator Murkowski, Senator Collins, they're public no's. If Senator Ernst decides to vote no, which she has not announced yet, how many votes can Hegseth lose at this point to be confirmed?
It really depends on absences. I can't decide or predict what will be the case tomorrow, but another senator voting against Hegseth will potentially be what could break this nomination, because if every single Democrat votes against him, which is what we saw happen in the procedural votes leading up to his confirmation. So really, this report coming out right before his vote tomorrow could potentially make it so that he doesn't become defense secretary.
All eyes on Senator Ernst and perhaps Senator McConnell and others. We'll see. A lot of people have been quiet. Daniela Diaz, Jasmine Wright, thank you so much for stopping by. We appreciate it. Coming up, what are judges saying about the president's decision to grant clemency to January 6 defendants? You're watching America Decides. Following President Trump's sweeping clemency for January 6 defendants, federal judges who presided over cases are letting their discontent be heard. U.S. District Judge Beryl Howell rebuked the president's claim of injustice, writing, quote, "This court cannot let stand the revisionist myth relayed in this presidential pronouncement." That's his quote. Let's bring in CBS News digital politics reporter Melissa Quinn. Melissa, great to have you here on America Decides. What's your new reporting on how judges are handling the pardons and the executive orders from President Trump?
Well, if you remember when President Trump issued his executive order on Monday, not only did he grant clemency to these 1,500 January 6 defendants, but he also ordered the Justice Department to dismiss any pending indictments against roughly 300 of these defendants. And this is what we're really hearing from these federal judges who have been overseeing these cases for the last 4 years. Now, the judges are granting these Justice Department requests to dismiss these pending indictments. But in doing so, they're issuing these very strongly worded orders where they're basically saying we cannot recast the events of January 6th in the way that President Trump has, trying to call it a day of love. They're pointing to some of the evidence, the images, the videos that have surfaced in some of these cases and saying this was a day of violence. This was a day in which 140 police officers were injured, and we cannot rewrite the history of that day.
So they're speaking out, but legally, does it have any weight for them to speak out? If the president, with all of his executive power, says get rid of those cases, is that effectively the end of the story?
Well, yes, it is. And the judges are granting the request to toss out the indictments. But I think what is notable here is that judges are not like public officials. They're not writing in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. They're not going on CNN or CBS and giving interviews talking about this is why I made this decision. This is what I think about these current events. Their opinions, their written orders are really where they are sort of showing their work. And I think that that is why you are seeing them here speak out so fervently against these pardons and saying, I want to do one quote from Judge Tanya Chutkan, who oversaw President Trump's prosecution that has since been dismissed. She said, dismissal cannot whitewash the blood, feces, and terror that the mob left in its wake. So they are certainly taking the opportunity to speak out against this sort of downplaying of the events.
Is there a precedent for a president to dismiss pending cases, possible indictments before they even happen? Is that something we've ever seen in history?
Well, the president can certainly do whatever he wants. And when it comes to the pardon power, I mean, that is expressly granted in the Constitution. I think you are seeing this sort of pushback against the expansion of that power that we've seen not only from President Trump, as Democrats are saying this is going too far, but also the pardons that were issued by former President Biden in his final hours in office, granting those pardons to his family members and then prior to his son, Hunter Biden.
I'm told that you have some new reporting on how the judges, some of them at least, are concerned about their own safety.
Absolutely, and that is something that we have seen play out really over the last 4 years. I mentioned Judge Chutkan. She had protection by U.S. Marshals. A woman from Texas was arrested shortly after President Trump was indicted. The case was assigned to her, and she left allegedly a very violent voicemail on Judge Chutkan's on her phone in her chambers. So this is definitely something that the judges are worried about and have been dealing with for quite some time.
Melissa Quinn, thank you so much for your reporting. We appreciate it. President Trump's domestic agenda on the international stage, from tax cuts to tariffs, he shares his plans at the World Economic Forum. You're watching America Decides.
My message to every business in the world is very simple. Come make your product in America, and we will give you among the lowest taxes of any nation on earth.
That was President Donald Trump's pitch to leaders at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. He's threatening tariffs if they don't make their products in the United States. David Wessel joins us now. He is a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution. Great to see you. Thanks for being with us. What do you make of President Trump and his threat of tariffs?
Well, President Trump goes to Davos, which is a gathering of business elites from all over the world, and gives a U.S.-style America First speech. So I think given that we need alliances in order to compete with China, it's sort of strange. I don't quite understand how this is going to work. He doesn't yet have congressional support for cutting the corporate tax rate to 15%. So it struck me as a lot of Trump bluster, and my principle at these days is watch what he does, not what he says.
So what do you make in terms of how other nations are going to respond to this? What's the reality of how not only nations but companies are going to handle this tariff program coming forward?
Well, we don't really know exactly what he is going to do on tariffs. As you know, he has a lot of authority. He can do tariffs without Congress. We know from the last time that there are lots of exemptions. It doesn't work to impose tariffs on things that we don't already make here. All that does is raise the price of what we pay. And other countries aren't going to sit idly by. Other countries, Canada, Mexico, have already begun talking about, well, you put tariffs on us, we're going to put tariffs on you, and that'll just, hurt our exporters. So it looks like we're in for some pretty tense times. One thing that really struck me about Davos was the Chinese vice premier spoke, and he was all about the virtues of globalization and everything. It was kind of bizarre to have the Chinese talking about the virtues of globalization and Donald Trump talking about America first. It proves that cynicism is not limited to one country.
When you look at economic policy, there's also the Federal Reserve and monetary policy that's part of that conversation. President Trump is threatening to try to lower interest rates. Is that possible, or is the Fed independent at this point?
The Fed is independent at this point. He really doesn't have any control over what the Fed does until he can replace Jay Powell in the spring of 2026 as the Fed chair. And I think he's going to make it hard for whoever Powell's successor is, because if the successor is seen as someone who will do Trump's bidding, then he's not only going to have resistance from inside the Fed, but it's going to push up the interest rates in the bond market. One thing that the president didn't talk about is, or he mentioned it, but not really dwell on it, is what does all this mean for the federal debt? And to the extent that the federal debt is going to be worse than projected, that's going to, A, push up long-term interest rates, and B, it's going to make the Fed reluctant to cut interest rates further. Tariffs will add to the pressure on the Fed, which is worried about bringing inflation down to its target. So I look at that as an early warning sign for the Fed that Trump is going to be beating up on them, and we'll see whether the Fed continues to have the backbone to stand up to him if that's what they think is the right economic policy for the country.
What do you make of the world economy's reaction to President Trump so far?
That's a good question. I think they've been preparing for this, so they're not surprised. I think they're gearing up to fight back. And I think that you're beginning to see some efforts, which are not necessarily in our interest, to have alliances that cut out the U.S. EU-Mexico recently did a trade deal. I think the Chinese are looking at this and saying, like, great, we've been trying to divide and conquer the West for some time, and now we have an ally in Donald Trump. So I think they're looking at this with a great deal of trepidation. I do think businesses are afraid of Trump. I'm sure some of them are going to move production here because they want to get ahead of tariffs. The businessmen who were on the panel at Davos were, I wouldn't say they were confrontational in the least. They all seem to be a bit afraid of him. But I do think people are waiting to see what he actually does. I think they've learned that he sometimes talks more loudly than he actually acts.
And then finally, tax reform or tax cuts are on the horizon now on Capitol Hill. Is that something that your sources in the economic community are paying close attention to?
Yeah, you bet. So, look, we all expect the individual tax cuts that were in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, which expire at the end of this year, to be extended. That's pretty much baked in. Everybody anticipates that. The question is, what more will they do? And what will that do to projections of the federal debt? And I think that President Trump it's easy for him to say, I'm going to cut the corporate tax rate to 15%, but unless he can get Congress to go along, it's just nothing more than rhetoric. And at this point, I don't think Congress is ready to cut taxes as much as he is talking about, but maybe that's his usual bargaining position and he'll settle for something less.
David Wessel, a veteran reporter and now analyst of these issues. We really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your expertise. That does it for us today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.